The night always feels different when you're far away from city lights. Out there, where the sky stretches wide and the silence presses close, every sound seems heavier, every shadow seems alive. And tonight, as you listen to this, I want you to picture yourself standing in a place where stories aren't just told, they're remembered. Stories about strange footsteps in the dark, voices that call your name from the trees, and shapes that move like animals but stare at you like humans. These are the kinds of moments that turn an ordinary night into a sleepless one. And this is where our story begins, out in the quiet, open desert where people whisper about something old, something watching, something they call a skinwalker. It started with three friends who just wanted a break from their busy lives. They weren't thrill seekers and they didn't come looking for anything scary. They just wanted fresh air, a long drive, and a place to camp where they could see the stars clearly. Their names were Eli, Mateo, and Jessa. They had grown up together, the kind of friends who felt more like family. When Jessa suggested a weekend trip away from everything, they all agreed without much thought. They packed a tent, some food, a couple of flashlights, and hit the road before sunset. The drive took them far from the noise of the world they were used to. As the miles rolled by, the radio slowly faded into static. Cell signals vanished. The roads thinned out until they were nothing but narrow lines between endless stretches of sand and scrub. The sky grew darker, deeper, almost too big to look at directly. But none of them minded. They liked the quiet. They liked the adventure. At least at first. By the time they found a place to set up camp, the last colors of daylight had nearly disappeared. The air was cool, the wind soft, and the world around them felt peaceful. They built a small fire, roasted some food, and talked like they used to back when their lives weren't so complicated. It felt good. It felt normal. But the desert has a way of reminding you that you're not in control, and that night, it started with a sound none of them could explain. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a small crack of a twig somewhere past the edge of their firelight. They paused, waited, and then laughed it off. Probably a rabbit or a deer, they said. The desert is full of them. But a few minutes later they heard it again. A slow, careful step. Then another. And another. Like something circling them, staying just out of sight. Eli aimed his flashlight into the darkness, but the beam didn't catch anything except empty land. The silence that followed felt heavier. The kind of silence that makes your heartbeat feel louder than it should. Mateo joked again, trying to keep things light, but his voice had a tiny shake he hoped no one noticed. Soon the fire burned lower. The wind picked up. The night got colder. They wrapped themselves in blankets and tried to relax, telling stories to keep their minds busy. But then Jessa froze. She looked toward the desert, her eyes wide, her face tight with confusion. She whispered that she heard someone calling her name. Not loudly. Not from far away. Just a soft voice, like someone standing right outside the ring of firelight. Eli and Mateo listened, trying to hear what she heard. At first all they caught was wind. But after a moment, something else slid through it, a faint sound, too soft to make out but too human to ignore. It didn't sound angry. It didn't sound distressed. It sounded familiar, almost comforting, like someone they knew. And that was the part that scared them most. They told Jessa it must have been the wind. She nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't go away. None of them wanted to admit it, but something about the voice felt wrong. Too close. Too gentle. Too perfectly shaped, like a human call to simply be the breeze bending through the desert. They tried to distract themselves again, but the energy around them had shifted. Even the fire seemed to burn differently, like it was shrinking away from something unseen. Mateo finally stood up, shining his flashlight in every direction. He said he just wanted to be sure nothing was out there. But the truth was, all of them needed the reassurance, even if they doubted they'd get it. As he moved the beam across the open land, the light caught something, just for a second. A shape. Low to the ground. Still. Watching. Mateo leaned forward, trying to understand what he was seeing. It looked like an animal, maybe a coyote, but the longer he stared, the more something inside him whispered that it wasn't. It stood too still. Its shape was just slightly wrong. And its eyes didn't shine the way animal eyes normally did in the light. They almost looked reflective. Like it understood that it was being watched. Mateo blinked and the shape was gone. He swung the light again, but there was nothing. Only open earth and dark emptiness. He laughed it off, but this time no one joined him. Eli suggested they get in the tent. They could talk inside, maybe play some music. Anything to break the tension. They all agreed, and for a moment they felt safer zipped inside the thin walls of nylon. They tried to ignore the way the wind pressed softly against the tent, like fingers running along the fabric. They tried to ignore the feeling that something outside was waiting for them to fall asleep. But just when they started to settle, the voice came again. This time clearer. This time closer. And this time it didn't call Jessa's name. It called Eli's. In the exact tone of someone he knew. Someone who wasn't anywhere near the desert. Eli stopped breathing for a moment. Mateo and Jessa looked at him, their faces pale in the dim lantern light. The voice outside repeated his name, soft, gentle, almost inviting. And then it shifted. The tone changed, like someone trying too hard to copy a human sound and almost getting it right but not quite. A wrong pitch. A strange edge. A strange rhythm. Eli whispered that they shouldn't move. They shouldn't speak. They shouldn't answer. Something outside was trying to get their attention, and it wasn't human. The three of them sat frozen, listening as the voice circled slowly around the tent. Step by careful step. Each one too heavy for a small animal but too controlled for something large. Like something walking on two legs, then four, then two again. And right as the voice stopped directly behind them, right as the night grew so quiet they could hear their own breaths, something pressed lightly against the tent wall. Just the faintest touch. Just enough to let them know it was there. And then, nothing. Silence. But the kind of silence that feels like a warning. The kind that tells you the night is far from over. The kind that keeps you awake long after the story ends. The seconds after the silence felt longer than minutes. Eli, Mateo, and Jessa sat completely still, afraid even to adjust their breathing. None of them dared look toward the tent wall where they had felt that soft touch. The fabric barely moved now, only shifting from the natural wind, but it carried a different weight, like the air outside had thickened with something watching, something waiting. Jessa's fingers slowly tightened around Eli's sleeve. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. And in that moment, every story they had ever heard about strange things in the desert crawled to the front of their minds. The stories people tell quietly, almost like they're afraid the words themselves might call something closer. The voice outside didn't come again. No footsteps. No breathing. No movement. Just stillness. Too much stillness. Mateo finally whispered that maybe it had left, but he didn't sound convinced, not even close. Eli shook his head slowly. Whatever it was, he said, it wasn't acting like an animal that wandered off. It acted like something deciding what to do next. They waited a little longer, listening for any sign. Eventually, the fire outside had burned down so much that the shadows inside the tent deepened. The small lantern they kept in the corner cast a faint glow, but it didn't make them feel safer. If anything, the way the light flickered on their faces made everything look more uncertain. Eli said they couldn't sit there forever. They needed a plan. But even saying that felt risky, like the sound of his voice might draw something back toward them. He suggested that maybe if they packed their things quietly, they could reach the car and leave before whatever was out there decided to come closer again. Mateo nodded, but Jessa didn't answer right away. She stared at the tent wall again, her expression tight. She whispered that something didn't feel right. Not about the idea of leaving. Not about staying. Just everything. She said she felt like whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was waiting for them to make a move. Eli tried to stay calm, but he felt the same thing. A kind of pressure in the air, almost like when you feel someone standing behind you long before you turn around. He took a breath and said they should at least check the time. He glanced at his phone, hoping for any sign of a signal. Of course there was none. But the time flickered on the screen, 3:14 a.m. He told the others. Mateo muttered that mornings always felt safer. They just needed to get through the next few hours. But even as he said it, the tent gave a small ripple on the opposite side. Not a push. Not a tap. Just the fabric moving, as if someone was slowly dragging their hand across it from the outside. Jessa covered her mouth to hold back a gasp. Eli reached toward the lantern, turning the light down until the tent dimmed. He thought maybe darkness would make them less noticeable. But the moment the light dimmed, the dragging sound stopped. The silence returned. And this time it felt colder. Mateo leaned closer and whispered that he had an idea. Something simple, something small, but something. He said they needed to make noise. Not loud noise, just enough to mask any sound they made while packing up. Maybe if they talked softly, acted normal, they could make their movements blend in. Eli wasn't sure it would help, but he didn't have another idea. So they started whispering about anything they could think of. Old memories, jokes, random thoughts, anything that sounded human and calm. And slowly, while they whispered, they began stuffing their bags quietly. Every zipper was moved inch by inch. Every item was tucked away carefully. It took almost 10 minutes to pack everything up. When they were finally ready, Eli crawled closer to the tent's front flap. He didn't open it yet. He just pressed his ear against the fabric and listened. The desert outside sounded empty. No steps. No wind. No voice. Nothing. He took a slow breath and whispered that he was going to unzip it just a little to look outside. Jessa grabbed his arm and said to wait. She felt something, some instinct telling her not to rush. But Eli said the longer they stayed, the harder it would be to leave. He lifted the zipper 1 millimeter at a time. A sliver of cold air seeped through. He opened it just wide enough to peek out. The fire was almost completely out, glowing faintly like a dying ember. The desert stretched in every direction, silent and still. Eli didn't see anything unusual. No shapes. No movement. No figures. He exhaled, relieved for the first time in almost an hour. He whispered that maybe they actually had a chance. He widened the flap just enough to step out. But before he moved, he froze. Far to the right, maybe 20 yards away, something was crouching. It wasn't moving. It wasn't making noise. It was just there, low to the ground, facing their direction. Eli didn't see its face. He only saw the outline. A shape that looked wrong. Too long. Too still. Too aware. He slowly backed away from the opening and closed the zipper again, trying not to let his hands shake. Mateo asked what he saw, but Eli didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice cracked just a little. He said something was still out there. Not close, but close enough to see them if they came out. Jessa whispered that maybe they should wait until sunrise. Maybe whatever it was would leave once daylight came. But Eli shook his head. He said they didn't know if sunrise would make a difference. And besides, by the time the sun came up, it might be even closer. The tent felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Every second became heavier. Eli suggested they could run for the car if they moved fast enough. But the car was a few minutes away, far enough that they would be exposed the entire time. Mateo asked what direction the shape was in. Eli pointed. They realized the car was in the opposite direction. That gave them the smallest bit of hope. Mateo said if they left quietly and didn't draw attention, maybe the creature, or whatever it was, wouldn't notice them. But it was a gamble. A huge one. Before they could decide, a soft sound came from the desert outside. Not footsteps. Not a voice. Just humming. Low, slow, almost human. But not quite. The sound you hear when someone is trying to copy a tone they don't fully understand. It drifted across the dark, growing just a little clearer with every passing second. Mateo swallowed hard. Jessa pulled her knees to her chest. Eli's eyes stayed fixed on the tent opening, as if expecting something to move there any second. The humming grew a little louder. And then it stopped. Not gradually. Like someone had cut it off suddenly. And in the heavy silence that followed, they heard something else. A breath. Right outside the tent. Slow. Controlled. Listening. And the three friends realized that whatever was outside wasn't waiting for sunrise. It was waiting for them. The breath outside the tent was so close that Eli felt it more than he heard it. A soft, steady exhale that brushed the fabric like a thin whisper. None of them moved. Not even a flinch. They sat frozen, staring toward the front of the tent as if blinking might draw attention. The lantern flickered again, low and uneven, casting small shadows that jumped around the inside walls. Mateo's hand shook slightly as he lifted a finger to his lips, signaling silence even though no one dared speak anyway. Jessa shut her eyes for a second as if gathering courage, then opened them and kept them locked on Eli. They all waited for him to decide what to do because he was closest to the opening. But Eli didn't have an answer. He didn't even know where to start. He pressed his hand against the ground, feeling the earth tremble just enough to know that something outside was shifting weight. Maybe leaning closer. Maybe listening harder. He could almost picture it, a shape crouched near the entrance, head tilted, trying to understand the sounds inside. Jessa's breathing grew quicker. She kept it controlled, but her chest rose and fell faster with every quiet inhale. Eli put a hand on her arm, steadying her, not because he felt calm but because he didn't want any sudden movement to draw attention. The breath outside stopped. The tent felt colder instantly as if something had stepped away, but not far. Eli leaned closer to the fabric inch by inch. He didn't touch it. He didn't want to risk showing their silhouette from inside. But he listened carefully. Nothing. No crunch of footsteps. No swaying of bushes. No humming. Just the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like whoever or whatever was outside had become absolutely motionless. Mateo whispered the slightest, "What is it doing?" Eli shook his head, barely moving. His voice was barely audible as he said, "I don't think it left." Then another sound came, light, slow and hard to identify. Not walking. More like scratching? But not on the tent. On the ground. A soft drag. Then another. Like fingers tracing circles in the dirt. Jessa covered her mouth again. The sound continued for a moment, then stopped. A new one replaced it, something tapping lightly against a small rock near their campsite. Not fast. Not repetitive. Just a single tap, a pause, another tap. Almost like knocking. Mateo whispered that it might be trying to get them to react. Eli agreed. And that meant they needed to do the opposite. They waited. Minutes passed so slowly it felt like time itself had stretched. The tapping stopped. The scratching stopped. The breathing stayed gone. But the silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like camouflage. Jessa leaned toward them and whispered that they should make a run for the car. She said staying inside the tent wasn't helping. It was flimsy, too thin, too exposed. If something wanted to get in, it easily could. At least outside they could see it coming. At least outside they could run. Mateo disagreed. He said they didn't know what direction it had moved in. It could be directly outside waiting. It could be circling the tent. It could be behind the car. They had no information. Running blind could be worse. Eli listened to both, feeling the pressure building. He didn't want them to sit here until morning if morning wasn't going to help. But he didn't want to send them into the dark either. He needed to check one thing before making a choice. He crawled to the back side of the tent, slowly, carefully, and pressed his ear against the fabric. He listened for anything, footsteps, breathing, movement. Nothing. He shifted to another side and listened again. Nothing. He crawled to the front, closest to the opening where he'd heard the breathing earlier. He held his breath and leaned in. And there it was, so faint he almost missed it at first. A sound like someone dragging their fingers gently down the fabric. Slow. Careful. Deliberate. He jerked back instantly, heart pounding so loud he was sure Jessa and Mateo could hear it. Mateo whispered, "It's right there?" Eli nodded. "Front side." Jessa's voice broke a little as she whispered, "Why is it still there? What does it want?" Eli didn't answer because the truth sat heavy in his mind, even if he didn't want to say it. It didn't feel like the creature wanted to hurt them immediately. It felt like it was studying them, observing them, learning them, like someone trying to mimic something unfamiliar. Mateo's voice trembled as he said they needed a distraction, something to draw its attention away long enough for them to run. But none of them had anything loud or bright enough to scare something off. Even if they used the lantern or shook the tent, it might just provoke it. Jessa whispered that maybe they could throw something out of the tent, something small like a water bottle, to make it look in that direction while they ran out the other side. Eli considered it. It wasn't a great plan, but it was a plan. Mateo reached for one of the empty bottles, moving slowly so it wouldn't make a crinkle sound. He handed it to Eli. Eli crawled to the far side of the tent, opposite from the creature's breathing earlier. He slowly unzipped the flap just an inch, just enough to toss the bottle without making noise. Before he threw it, he paused. There were footprints outside. Not animal prints. Bear prints. Human-sized. But the toes were long. Too long. The arch too shallow. And the tracks circled the tent more times than he could count, overlapping in strange looping patterns, as if the creature had been walking around them again and again while they whispered inside. Eli felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He closed the flap gently and didn't throw the bottle. When he turned around, his face was pale. Jessa asked quietly what he saw. Eli shook his head, unable to find the right words at first. Then he whispered, "It's been circling us, a lot. The tracks look wrong." Mateo swallowed hard. "So we don't run?" Eli didn't know. The moment he tried to think clearly, another sound came, soft and sudden, right outside the front entrance. A voice. Not quite human. But not fully animal either. It spoke Eli's name again. Only this time it wasn't whispering. It was right outside. Inches away. And then, very slowly, it said something new. A word none of them had spoken. A word none of them had mentioned. A word the creature should not have known. It said, "Open." The tent zipper twitched. Just a tiny movement. As if something outside was trying to pull it down. Jessa's eyes went wide. Mateo grabbed the lantern. Eli reached for the zipper to hold it in place before it slid further. The creature on the other side twisted the zipper again. Once. Twice. Each time firmer. Each time more certain. And the three friends realized something that sent ice through their veins. It wasn't just mimicking voices. It was learning how to use its hands. And the zipper slid another inch. Too easily. Too carefully. Something outside was getting better at being human. Eli kept his hand locked on the zipper, his fingers tightening as if it were the only thing keeping the night from slipping inside. The creature outside tugged again, slower this time, almost testing him. Mateo held the lantern close, not raising it too high, afraid the extra light might give away their shadows. Jessa pressed her back against the opposite wall of the tent, trying to stay as quiet as she could while her heartbeat pounded so heavily she thought for sure the thing outside must hear it. The zipper stopped moving just for a moment. Then a soft breath rolled across the outside of the tent, warm enough that Eli felt it through the fabric. He knew the creature was inches away. He knew that if he even loosened his grip a little, the zipper would slide down easily. The breath faded. The night turned quiet again. Too quiet. Mateo mouthed, "Why is it doing that?" Eli didn't know. But something about the way the creature acted was different from any animal he'd ever seen. Animals didn't test tents. Animals didn't mimic voices. Animals didn't slowly learn how things worked. Whatever this was wasn't hunting them the way an ordinary creature would. It was studying them, watching them, trying to understand them. Jessa whispered that she wanted to leave, even if it meant risking the darkness. But Eli shook his head. Leaving now would expose them too much. The thing outside was too close. They needed more information before making any decision. They needed to know what they were dealing with. Mateo lowered the lantern so only the bottom half of the tent glowed. He whispered that maybe this wasn't the creature people warned about in old desert stories. Maybe it was something older. Something people whispered about but never described clearly. He had heard versions of stories growing up, warnings told by travelers or locals who lived near remote places. Stories about beings that shifted between forms. Stories about creatures that watched from a distance until they learned your shape, your voice, your habits. Stories that always ended with the same warning. If something calls you with the voice of someone you know, don't answer. Jessa reminded him that none of them answered when the creature spoke. That had to mean something. Maybe it was waiting for them to talk. Maybe the silence was keeping them safe for now. Or maybe it was confusing the creature. They didn't know. Eli listened to them talk, but his mind drifted to earlier in the day, before the desert felt so threatening. He remembered the drive, the jokes, the way the sky opened up bigger than anything they'd seen in months. He remembered how peaceful everything felt when they first arrived. He wondered if they had somehow wandered into a place they weren't supposed to be. A place that looked empty but wasn't. He thought back to the moment he first saw the shape crouching in the distance. The way it didn't move. The way it watched. He had tried to convince himself it was an animal then. But now, with the zipper trembling under his fingers, he knew that whatever was outside belonged to a kind of story people usually laughed off, until something like this happened. The quiet outside shifted again. Not a sound, just a feeling. The kind of feeling you get when someone steps into a room behind you. The pressure of presence. The weight of being watched. Eli felt it through the ground, the air, the tent walls. The creature had moved. Slowly. Quietly. But definitely moved. He whispered to the others, "It's not in front anymore." Jessa's breath hitched. Mateo turned the lantern slightly, making the shadows jump again. Eli motioned for them to stay still. Then he leaned his ear toward the tent wall, listening carefully. He could hear something faint, a soft brushing along the side like fingertips tracing the fabric. Then a pause. Then the same sound on a different part of the tent. Like the creature was moving around them again. Jessa lifted her knees closer to her chest. She whispered that it felt like the creature was circling with intention, not randomly. Not looking for food but looking for something else. Some kind of pattern. A response. A weakness. Mateo swallowed hard and whispered that he had heard a story from his grandfather when he was little. A story about something in the desert that could wear the shape of the familiar. A thing that watched travelers for hours before trying to mimic them. His grandfather told him these creatures were patient. Too patient. They didn't chase people. They waited until people made mistakes on their own. Jessa asked him why he never mentioned this before. Mateo said he never believed it. Not really. It was one of those stories adults told to scare kids into being careful. He never thought he'd actually feel the truth of it in the dark. The brushing sound on the tent wall stopped again. Then the quiet deepened so much it almost hurt their ears. The kind of quiet that felt intentional. Eli whispered that the creature didn't just mimic voices. It had started learning how to copy words. Open. That was a word it shouldn't know. Unless it had heard them say it earlier. Maybe during setup. Maybe while they were laughing, talking, zipping the tent closed earlier that evening. Jessa whispered that if it could learn one word, what would stop it from learning others? If it could mimic one voice, what would stop it from mimicking theirs perfectly? What if it could imitate them so well that one of them responded by accident? Eli didn't want to think about that. The lantern dimmed slightly, its battery beginning to weaken. The glow around them softened, fading into a warmer but weaker light. Mateo stared at it, panic flickering in his eyes. They needed the lantern. Losing light meant losing awareness of each other's movements, shadows, and the tent's boundary. Jessa whispered that they needed to conserve the lantern. They needed to turn it down even more. Eli agreed, even though the thought of sitting in a dimmer tent made his chest tighten. Still, he reached for the lantern dial and lowered the brightness until the tent was lit only enough to see each other's faces faintly. Darkness pressed in from every side. Minutes passed like hours. They listened for any clue about the creature's location, but the night gave nothing away. No footsteps. No breathing. No voice. Just the steady hum of silence. Jessa whispered that maybe the creature was gone again. Maybe it had lost interest. Maybe it had found something else in the desert. Eli didn't believe that, but he didn't say it out loud. Mateo didn't believe it either, judging by the way he kept glancing at every inch of the tent. Then they heard it again. Not a breath. Not footsteps. This time, it was a sound that stopped Eli's heart entirely. A voice. Mateo's voice. Outside the tent. Whispering softly. Calling Jessa's name. Jessa froze instantly. Her eyes widened in shock, then confusion, then fear. The voice outside sounded almost perfect. Almost. The tone was right, the pace was right, but the rhythm was off by the slightest bit. Like someone trying to sing a familiar melody but missing the tiny details that made it human. Mateo's real voice inside the tent trembled. "That's not me," he whispered. Jessa clutched her jacket with both hands. Then the voice outside spoke again. This time clearer. A perfect copy of Mateo, calling out gently as if checking on her. As if inviting her to step outside. Eli pressed a hand on Jessa's shoulder before she could react. She nodded, signaling she understood, but her breathing grew uneven. The voice outside took a step closer. Then another. It stopped right at the side of the tent. And in a perfect imitation of Mateo, it whispered, "Come here." Mateo shook his head violently. "Don't move," he breathed. The creature outside tried again. "Come here." This time, the voice cracked ever so slightly, like it was forcing itself into shape. Eli tightened his grip on the zipper again. He knew something now, something important. The creature wasn't just testing them. It was practicing, learning, improving. Every minute that passed, it was getting better at being them. And the most terrifying part was simple. It wasn't finished yet. Mira stayed close to the window for a long moment, staring into the dark line of trees as if hoping they would reveal something. The cold outside hadn't changed, but something in the air felt heavier, like the quiet had grown thicker. Farhan folded the map and set it gently on the table, trying to make sense of the strange symbols again, but even he couldn't hide the way his hands shook a little. The cottage felt safe but not safe enough, and that uncertainty kept both of them on edge. Farhan finally stepped back from the table and let out a slow breath. "It's still the same," he said. 3 marks. The cabin. The ridge. And the last one, whatever that place is. His voice softened near the end, as though naming it might make something real that he didn't want to face. Mira walked toward him, eyes moving over the old papers scattered around. The faded handwriting, the torn corners, the odd little drawings mixed between the notes. Everything looked like someone had been researching something serious, something they didn't have time to finish. She picked up a small notebook and flipped through it again. Most pages were empty except for a few lines. But every line felt deliberate. Every line felt like a warning. "Why would someone hide all of this?" she asked softly. "If they wanted people to stay away, why not just board up the place or leave a message outside?" Farhan didn't answer right away. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. Maybe they thought someone would come looking. Maybe they expected us. Mira frowned. "Us? Why us?" Farhan gave a small shrug, but she could see the unease in his eyes. It wasn't about them specifically, it was about anyone curious enough to follow the trail that led here. The forest, the abandoned path, the strange silence, all of it felt connected. And that made the mystery even heavier. A cold wind pushed against the walls and both of them turned at the same time. The sound wasn't loud, but it made Myra's heart skip. Farhan walked to the door and rested his hand on the latch, not opening it, just listening. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. "It's fine," he whispered, but it didn't sound convincing. He stepped away and forced a small smile. Mira didn't call him out on it. She understood. Neither of them wanted to admit how unsettled they felt. They sat together at the table and spread the papers out in a careful line. If there were answers here, they had to find them. Farhan pointed to the second mark on the map, the one near the ridge. "This has a date next to it," he said. "Maybe something happened there." Mira leaned closer. The date was old, older than they expected, almost like it belonged to another story entirely. But the person who owned this cabin had circled it 3 times. That meant something. "So the ridge might be the next step," Mira said. But we still don't know what the first step was. She tapped the symbol near the cabin. It looked like a swirl, almost like wind. Or motion. Or something spiraling downward. The same symbol appeared on one of the loose pages, surrounded by quick scribbles in pencil. Phrases about sound, distance, and something about timing. None of it made sense yet, but it hinted at something bigger than they understood. As they tried to connect the clues, the room felt smaller and smaller, as though the walls knew something they didn't. Mira glanced at the lantern near the door. Its flame flickered gently, casting moving shadows across the rough walls. One shadow stretched longer than the others, and for a split second she thought it moved in a way the light couldn't explain. But when she blinked, it was gone. She didn't say anything. She didn't want to create fear where there might be none. Instead, she focused on another detail, an unfinished sentence in the notebook. It ended abruptly, the pencil stroke dragging off the page as if the writer had been interrupted. "Farhan," she said quietly, showing it to him. "Look." He read it carefully and his expression tightened. "If anyone finds this, remember that the forest never." The rest was blank. Farhan exhaled slowly. "That's not comforting." Mira nodded. "But it means whoever wrote this wasn't trying to scare anyone. They were trying to warn them." That realization made both of them sit straighter. A warning meant danger. Real danger. But it also meant someone had survived long enough to leave a message. They spent the next few minutes piecing everything together: dates, marks, symbols, scattered notes. The story forming between the lines wasn't clear, but it hinted at something hidden in the forest, something connected to sound, movement, and certain areas marked by the previous owner. The conflict they were stepping into wasn't just a simple mystery. It was layered, full of things left unsaid and trails half covered by time. Farhan suddenly paused. "Do you hear that?" Mira listened. It was faint, like a distant vibration or a low hum coming from outside. Not threatening but strange, almost like nature holding its breath. She didn't move. "Yes," she whispered. "It's coming from the ridge direction." They exchanged a look, part worry, part curiosity. Curiosity had brought them this far, but now it felt like a force pulling them forward. They couldn't ignore it, even if they wanted to. The tension grew as they prepared for what came next. Farhan packed the map and notebook carefully, making sure nothing tore further. Mira checked the lantern and tested the matches. They weren't planning to leave the cabin yet, but they both felt the need to be ready. They didn't talk much during this time. Words felt too small compared to the weight of the unknown pressing at the windows. As they settled again, Mira finally said, "Do you think the person who lived here planned to come back?" Farhan thought for a long moment. "If they did," he answered, "they never made it." That idea sat heavy in the air. It wasn't fear, just a quiet realization that whatever they were dealing with had already affected someone before them. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees again, softer this time, but still carrying something unsettling. Mira looked out the window once more. The forest seemed endless, shadowed, patient. As if it was waiting. "Tomorrow," Farhan said finally. "We go to the ridge tomorrow. But tonight, we stay alert." Mira nodded. The story around them was growing deeper, pulling them into layers they hadn't imagined when they first stepped onto the trail. Nothing was solved yet. Nothing was clear. But the mystery was alive and they were now in the middle of it. And the forest, silent and watchful, seemed to know it too. Farhan barely slept that night. He kept waking up to the smallest sounds, the rustle of branches outside, the soft knock of wind against the wooden walls, even the tiny creaks of the old cabin settling. Each time he sat up and listened, making sure nothing had changed. Mira tried to rest as well, but her mind kept circling back to the map, the symbols, and that unfinished warning. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that the forest was hiding something just out of sight, something waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. By early morning, a thin, pale light slipped through the window. It wasn't warm or comforting. It just made everything look washed out, like the world was holding itself back. Mira wrapped her jacket tightly around herself and glanced at Farhan, who was already awake and quietly studying the map again. His face was serious, focused, and she knew he was trying to stay calm for both of them. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Mira nodded, even though her stomach tightened. She wasn't sure what they were walking into, but she knew they had to follow the clues. Staying in the cabin with unanswered questions felt worse than stepping into the unknown. They packed lightly, just the essentials. The lantern, matches, the map, the notebook, and a small first aid kit. Mira checked the door slowly before opening it, her hand tense on the handle. The moment the door swung outward, a cold wave of air swept inside, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and pine. It felt different from the night before. Sharper. More alert. The forest greeted them with silence again, but this time the silence felt thicker, like it had weight. They stepped outside, letting the door close behind them, and began walking toward the ridge. The path was narrow and covered in fallen leaves, but clear enough to follow. The deeper they went, the more they felt that strange pressure in the air, something that made the hairs on their arms lift. Farhan checked the map often, tracking their progress. "We're on the right path," he said, though his voice sounded tight. "It should be straight ahead, then up toward that rock formation." Mira looked in the direction he pointed. The ridge was barely visible through the trees, a dark line rising above the forest floor. As they walked, she noticed small things: broken twigs, patches where the leaves looked disturbed, faint marks on certain tree trunks. They weren't scratches or carvings. They looked intentional, like simple signs or symbols guiding someone long ago. "Someone marked this trail," she whispered. Farhan nodded quietly. Maybe the same person who left the notes. That thought made Mira walk faster, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. The air grew colder as they climbed the slope toward the ridge. Every step seemed to echo softly in the quiet forest, even though they tried to move carefully. At one point, Mira stopped and looked behind them. Nothing was there, but the lingering feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. It wasn't threatening, just aware. Observing. When they finally reached the ridge, the view opened up. Below, the forest spread endlessly, a sea of dark green broken only by thin lines of fog drifting above the ground. But it wasn't the view that caught their attention. It was the sound. The faint hum they had heard the night before was slightly louder here. Still soft, but clearer, like a vibration beneath the earth. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural either. It was something in between, something that didn't make sense but felt important. Farhan kneeled and placed his hand on the ground. "It's coming from down there," he said. "Maybe there's something under the ridge." Mira crouched beside him. The vibration was gentle, like the earth breathing slowly. But it carried a strange rhythm, almost like a pattern. And then she noticed something near the edge, an old wooden post half buried in the soil. She brushed dirt away and found a carved symbol. The same spiral from the map in the notebook. "Farhan," she said quietly. "Look." He studied it with wide eyes. "This is the same mark, which means this place was important." He ran his fingers over the carving, tracing its curve. Maybe this is why the owner left the message. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a whisper of cold air past them. Mira stood up slowly, scanning the area again. The ridge felt alive, buzzing with a kind of tension that made her heart thump harder. Farhan noticed her unease and stepped closer. "We're getting close," he said. "Too close to stop now." They walked along the ridge, following more symbols carved into rocks and old wooden markers. Each one pointed toward a narrow path leading downward, deeper into a darker part of the forest. The canopy here was thicker, blocking much of the daylight and giving everything a muted, shadowed look. As they entered the path, the humming sound grew stronger, still soft but unmistakably present. Mira felt it in her chest, like a gentle pulse that synced with her heartbeat. Farhan glanced at her. "Do you feel that too?" She nodded. "Yeah. It feels like it's calling us." They continued carefully, each step increasing the sense of anticipation building between them. The forest around them changed subtly, trees leaning in different directions, patches of moss glowing faintly under the dim light, rocks arranged in ways that didn't look natural. It was as if they had crossed into a part of the woods untouched by time. Then they saw it. A clearing ahead, perfectly circular, as if carved out by something intentional. In the center stood a large stone structure, weathered but still intact, covered in more spiraling symbols. The ground around it seemed smoother, like people had once gathered here or walked around it often. Mira stepped forward slowly. This must be what the notes were pointing to. Farhan stared at the structure, his breath catching. The humming was louder here, not overwhelming but constant, like the air itself was vibrating around the stone. "Something happened here," he whispered. "Something big." They circled the structure carefully, taking in every detail. The symbols weren't random. They formed a pattern, a sequence that seemed to lead toward the center stone, a place that looked like it once held something important.